Good evening, everyone. My name is Hilda Fernandez. I'm a Lacanian psychoanalyst practicing in Vancouver, and it is my privilege and my pleasure to chair this interesting panel today entitled Weaponizing Words, the Dilemmas of Free Speech. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting in the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So we want to acknowledge that. And we are here to discuss a controversial theme, freedom of speech. As you all know, this is the Article 19 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, and reads something like this. People, human beings, have the right to express an opinion without fear of retaliation or censorship. Let's say I want to express how much I feel uncomfortable or in favor of X, Y, or Z. This, of course, comes with responsibilities and restrictions. It has its limits: obscenity, defamation, privacy, perjury. So technically, you can express yourself as long as you do not interfere with the rights of others, that you don't harm others. One of the many problems is that my X, Y, or Z is subjected to interpretation of what is harmful and what is an offense. We enter an absolute ambiguous territory. It's not a clear-cut definition valid for most of what is free speech. This situation has been present around themes such as LGBTQ2+, feminism, sexual etiquette, or critiques to vulnerable or minority populations. This is also heightened in our information era, as we know, with sites such as 4chan. We are here then to discuss this interesting theme, and let's have this conversation in a civil, respectful way. My participation here would be to facilitate the conversation between the panelists and with the public, with the audience. We first are going to hear Samir Gandesha's talk, who has been focusing on the importance of free speech, particularly around academic freedom, as he has expressed in his recent text in Open Democracy in defense of free speech of last March. And then we will have the responses by Morgane Ogre and Josh Paterson. So let me introduce Samir. Samir Gandesha is an associate professor in the Department of the Humanities and the director of the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University. He specializes in modern European thought and culture with a particular emphasis on the 19th and 20th centuries. His work has appeared in Political Theory, New German Critique, Constellations Logos, Kant Studium, Philosophy and Social Criticism, Topia, The European Legacy, the European Journal of Social Theory, Art Papers, the Cambridge Companion to Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, as well as in several other edited books. He is co-editor with Lars Rensman of Arendt and Adorno, Political and Philosophical Investigations. He is co-editor of 2 books with Johan Hartel of A Spell of Capital, Reification and Spectacle, and recently Aesthetic Marx. He also has contributed to Open Democracy, Canadian Dimension, the Vancouver Sun, and the Globe and Mail. In the spring of 2017, he was the Liu Boming Visiting Scholar in Philosophy in the University of Nanjing and visiting lecturer at Suzhou University of Science and Technology in China. So without further ado, let's welcome Samir, and we're here to hear you.
Thank you so much, Hilda, and thank you all for coming this evening. It's a beautiful summer evening, and so it's nice it's very nice to see you here in the audience to discuss this crucial issue, crucial question. I think one of the crucial questions of our age. So I have a few things to say about that in a second before I get into the substance of my talk. But before I go any further, I would like to also acknowledge that we're on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Let me just provide a little bit of a context for my interest in this question. It has to do really with a number of things, which themselves lead to a number of different dilemmas. First, I speak as an academic, as a citizen, but first and foremostly, as a director of the Institute for the Humanities. I've been director for several years now, and as such, I've really tried, working with the steering committee, to open the space up for a vigorous discussion of difficult ideas that often challenge the status quo, the powers that be. At least this is what we would like to think. Maybe it's not the case, but this is the intention. I think it is the case, though, because over the years we have faced mounting pressures to change direction, to change tack, to maybe moderate the kinds of things that we do. That gives me a sense that we're actually doing the right thing, that we are poised in a discussion here in this city, in the province, and hopefully to some extent in the country. We're raising difficult questions and fostering difficult conversations. So we've been criticized, certainly, as I said, from the powers that be, but also, so you'd say from the right, but also we've been criticized from the left for some of the choices that we've made. And some of the programming decisions that we've made have been decisions to invite people to speak that we don't necessarily personally agree with, but think that their arguments and their views are important to be aired and to discuss further. And this is a principle that we're absolutely committed to, and I think this is a fundamental principle, not just of free speech, but also of academic freedom. So this is something we're going to continue to do, but I thought it would be worthwhile to reflect a little bit on this and to take this up and to try and think of reasons that could possibly justify this. And the fact that one has to justify this already tells us that we're in a condition right now of crisis. When I put it to the steering committee that we have a kind of forum or a discussion on free speech, well, hold on, that's controversial. There wasn't a suggestion that we do otherwise, but there was a suggestion that, boy, oh boy, we could get ourselves in some hot water. All the more reason, again, to have this forum and have this discussion. We are in a condition of crisis in our liberal democracies, and that's one of the reasons to really take this up in a kind of robust sort of way. But I really want to emphasize the dilemma in the title of my talk, on the dilemmas of free speech, so in the subtitle. These dilemmas I really want to take very seriously. That is to say, when one tries to create an open space for free expression of speech and ideas, one courts and we've seen how this is working in the last few years. One courts a certain kind of willing and knowing attempt to cause others insult and hurt and harm. So one has to be really aware of the stakes here. And I myself am extremely aware of this. I have been myself the subject of racialized violence, both through words and through action. One example in particular, which is fitting given the fact that World Cup is on, in 1982 I went to try out for a professional soccer team, and I ended up on my way back from, unsuccessful unfortunately, but on my way back on a train from Aberdeen, eastern part of Scotland, to London. And I was in a train filled with, I believe, Arsenal supporters. And I really thought that I wasn't going to get out alive that night. And the guy that I was traveling with, who was also an aspiring player, thought the same. We were under siege. So I understand full well the dangers that are attendant upon free speech. But I also am committed to the idea that we really need, for the reasons of dissent, for political reasons, to create a kind of space where we can defend and indeed employ free speech and expression, to engage in speaking truth to power. I think this is really vitally important. So the last thing I'll say, just as a kind of preliminary note, is that I try to bring to these reflections what Edward Said calls a kind of contrapuntal approach. And the contrapuntal approach is the approach of the exile, of somebody who does have allegiances to more than one place. And one of the things that has also made me very wary of the kinds of group identities in the name of which free speech could be curtailed is the experience of my own family, which was expelled from Uganda in 1972 on the basis of a certain kind of agenda of Africanization. And this has always reminded me about the violence of identities and the violence that can authorize certain kinds of limitations on speech and expression, on individual liberty. So this is part of, in a sense, my contrapuntal approach, and that is that we can't just talk about free speech in the context of what's happening in the downtown east side, or in Vancouver, or in BC, or in the country as a whole. There's a larger world out there and a global context. And in that context, if you look at the question of free speech and expression, things look quite different from how they look in North America, especially in the United States. The United States is exceptional, not in the sense that it wants to understand itself, US exceptionalism, but in its absolutist ideas of freedom of speech. I don't even think those ideas are fully absolutist, but there does seem in the United States to be comparatively fewer restrictions on free speech. So we have to be quite aware of these contexts and the way in which we respond to the unique context that we're in, but also recognize that overall there is a global trend towards authoritarianism. There's a global trend towards cracking down on the conditions that would allow for dissent. I think we really need to make this very clear to ourselves and think about that when we're addressing the limits and possibilities of free speech and expression here and now, and the kinds of, let's say, costs that might give rise to in terms of a defense. That is a bit of an opaque point, but I hope it'll be a bit clearer once I get into my talk. What I've done is essentially taken the open democracy piece, and I've tried to sort of think through some of the arguments and counter-arguments around free speech. It's really me just trying to think things through. I think that itself is almost a political act in and of itself, because it's saying, look, there are arguments, and we need to take them seriously, take the arguments seriously on both sides. You know, what are the justifications for, and what are the counter-arguments against unrestricted free speech? And then what happens when we come out the other side? If in places it seems a little unclear, it's because I'm thinking this through. I don't have any answers. If you're coming here tonight to say, well, you know, Samir Gandesha is going to give me the answer on what free speech is, what its limitations are, and so on, forget it. I'm not going to do that. Maybe Josh can help in that respect, probably better than I can. But I would just want to think these questions through a little bit. And it's actually part of a number of essays that I've sort of worked on in the last while, some of which have been published, others haven't. But questions of cultural appropriation, questions of symbolic politics versus politics addressing structures of inequality. These are the things that I'm thinking about. And in fact, I was just approached this morning by a publisher who's interested in this question of social inequality versus symbolic politics, because he thought it was heterodox and therefore important to integrate into a kind of discussion. So it's kind of in that spirit that I offer this set of reflections. So the first starting point for me, really, and I've got a little bit of an outline here, the preliminary marks, it's just a historical sketch. I think it's important on the left, and I've seen myself, position myself very much on the left here, is to remember that free speech and expression is fundamentally grounded in the bourgeois revolution. And the bourgeois revolution comprises of a series of historical events, the Renaissance, the various Protestant reformations, the Peace of Westphalia, ending the 30 Years' War, 1648, the Industrial Revolution starts at the end of the 18th century, and of course the political revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Glorious Revolution, 1688, the American Revolution, 1776, the French Revolutions of 1789 and 1848. These are really crucial in constituting the bourgeois revolution. How we situate ourselves vis-a-vis that revolution, how we situate ourselves vis-a-vis the French Revolution in particular, and also the Enlightenment, is really crucial to how we'll approach these questions today. And I think this is really important to keep in mind. So what I try to do is really focus in the talk on the significance of the Copernican revolution in particular. The Copernican revolution, which is in a sense completed by Galileo. So the watershed moment was here of Galileo, who, with the recently invented instrument of the telescope, was able to definitively show the veracity of the revolution in physics initiated by Nicholas Copernicus in his book on the revolution of the celestial spheres, published in 1543, postulating the heliocentric as opposed to the geocentric picture of the universe. Heliocentrism had been declared to be a heretical view by the Inquisition in 1666. 5 years after the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, Bertolt Brecht wrote the play Life of Galileo, in which he explores the relationship between the dogmatism of the church on the one hand and the new scientific outlook represented by Galileo on the other. One of its most powerful scenes is the one in which the astronomer is engaged in a discussion with church philosophers who point to certain passages in Aristotle's writings as evidence for geocentrism. Galileo instead enjoins them to consider the evidence presented by the telescope, in which he shows the Medicean stars as evidence for heliocentrism. Galileo was tried and condemned by the church, as some people will know here, in 1633. Fortunately for him, he was sentenced only to house arrest until his death, which was much less a punishment than was meted out to Giordano Bruno, who had been burned at the stake at Campo di Fiore in Rome 33 years earlier for the crime of making a similar defense of the heretical Copernican model. Now, I just want to show you a short clip. It's quite good.
Your Highness, shall we begin with an observation of the satellites of Jupiter, the Medicean stars?
Sit down here, please.
Thank you, my boy. No, I'm afraid it's not as simple as that. Before we use your celebrated instrument, Mr. Galilei, we beg the favor of a disputation. Subject, can these moons exist?
A formal disputation?
Why don't you just look through the telescope and see for yourselves?
Here, please.
Yes. You are aware that your proposition, that there are stars revolving round some center other than the Earth, that there is nothing holding the universe up, is in contradiction to the wisdom of the ages?
Yes.
Apart from my mathematical friend's reservations as to whether these moons are possible, I, as a philosopher, ask you, are they necessary? Aristoteli, divini, universal.
Shall we speak in everyday language? My colleague, Mr. Federzoni, doesn't understand Latin.
Does that matter?
Yes.
The debate will be less brilliant, but it's your house. The cosmos of the divine Aristotle, with its crystal spheres and their mystical music, is an edifice of incomparable order and beauty. Why should we go out of our way to look for things which can only strike a discord in that ineffable harmony?
Your Highness, would you care to observe these unnecessary and impossible stars through the telescope?
Mr. Galileo, nobody doubts that your brainchild, or shall we say your adopted brainchild, is brilliantly contrived, but one is tempted to observe that if your tube shows something that cannot exist, it must be a rather unreliable tube.
How's that?
So with the utmost deference, Mr. Galileo, I suggest that what one sees in your eyeglass and what is in the heavens might be two entirely different things.
Admirably put. Great restraint.
They think we painted the Medicean stars on the lens.
Are you accusing me of fraud?
Oh, we wouldn't dream of it in the presence of His Highness.
Is there something wrong with my stars?
Your Highness's stars are fine. The gentlemen are only wondering whether they really exist.
Can you see the claws on the Great Bear?
Yes, and everything on the bull.
Are you gentlemen going to look or not?
Certainly.
What's the matter with you?
They're stupid.
Deplorable child.
Your Highness, I have just received an important message. I think we should go at once.
Gentlemen, the sum of our knowledge is pitiful. It has been my singular good fortune to get hold of a new instrument that brings a small patch of the universe a little bit closer. It's at your disposal. Make use of it.
Your Highness, ladies and gentlemen, where is all this leading?
Are we as scholars concerned with where the truth might lead us?
Mr. Galileo, the truth might lead us anywhere.
Your Highness, these nights, all over Italy, telescopes are being turned on the sky. The moons of Jupiter have never been seen before, and yet they exist. The man in the street may conclude that a good many other things may exist if only he opens his eyes. Gentlemen, we oughtn't to be defending shaky doctrines.
You are teachers. You ought to be doing the shaking.
I wish your man would keep out of what is supposed to be a scientific debate.
Your Highness, it looks as if we have to go to the shipyards nowadays to find the high curiosity that was the glory of Greece.
Well, I'm sure Mr. Galileo will find admirers in the shipyards.
Your Highness, I find this highly informative discussion has exceeded the time we allowed for it. It is imperative that we leave at once.
What if my cakes, Your Highness?
But you need only to look through the telescope.
His Highness will, of course, seek the opinion of the greatest living authority, Christopher Clavius, astronomer-in-chief at the Papal College in Rome.
This is a key point. The truth might lead us anywhere. And the Church is very concerned about this. And I think that's something to bear in mind. So the alternative model or paradigm of the heliocentric world would form the basis for the scientific revolution, both in terms of its content, a universe with the sun rather than the earth at its center, and its form, a new method of science based on the empirical testing of hypotheses, and the presupposition of what Edmund Husserl called the mathematization of nature. If the Aristotelian philosophers were conducting normal science by seeking to square new evidence with the guiding assumptions of the existing concept of the world, then according to philosopher and historian of science Thomas S. Kuhn, Copernicus and Galileo were engaging in revolutionary science by challenging those very premises, that is, by literally turning the established picture of the universe upside down. And this was to be of great consequence. It far exceeded the relatively narrow realms of philosophy, theology, and science, but contributed profoundly to the unsettling of social, economic, and political relations. This would, of course, be in Brecht's interest. The scientific revolution was both the expression of and laid the foundation for the future bourgeois order. This was so because, taken with the other events that I just mentioned, the Copernican revolution led to a fundamental disruption of the idea that all of being demonstrated three basic features. One, plenitude, or the idea of fullness. Two, continuity. And three, most importantly, gradation, that established a hierarchy from inanimate objects like stones all the way up to the ends perfectissimum of God himself. This is what the Johns Hopkins intellectual historian Alfred O. Lovejoy called the great chain of being. I want to emphasize the radicality of free speech in this respect because it explains why it is recently taken to be central to the agenda of the left, broadly construed. And I'll just make a very quick point here. It has been taken as central to the left's project up until, I would say, the late 1980s. And this has to do with a number of things. Just briefly put, and we can come back to this in the discussion if necessary, you have an increasing emphasis placed on the role of recognition and the possibility of misrecognition, disrespect, or indeed non-recognition is constituting a kind of harm to the person. And this is something that we see in the work, especially of our own Charles Taylor. But also, it's present in Frantz Fanon's work, and I'll mention that again a bit later. So you have that. You have at the same time in 1988 you have the Rushdie Fatwa. So this is then a recognition of the kind of harm or insult that could be done, or insult and therefore also understood as harm that could be done to a particular community through the, in particular here in this case, the publication of the Satanic Verses. So 1988. Then you also have an increasing influence at this time of anti-porn feminists such as McKinnon and Dworkin, who come to understand porn as a kind of hate speech and also as fundamentally violating equality provisions of the US Constitution. This is another dimension. You can actually layer another one on, and this is this goes back to the 1970s. In the 78, you have the publication of Orientalism by Edward Said, and you have a post-colonial critique of the way in which the other is presented as always already inferior and subordinate to the West. So taken together, representations matter. Representations can be violent. Representations then can also be restricted in particular kinds of ways. So I think that the question of free speech, we might want to say, oh, well, we've become more sensitive to the question in the last few years with its weaponization by the alt-right, people like Richard Spencer, of course, Milo Yiannopoulos and others, Breitbart, and 4chan, and so on. But there's a longer story here, and one of the things that I really am intent to indicate in the open democracy piece is the way in which it's not fascist speech or potentially fascist speech, far-right speech that's being targeted. It's often speech on the left. So leftists trying to silence other self-identified leftists. Case of Rebecca Tuvel, case of Dana Schutz, case of Laura Kipnis, and there are indeed many others that we could discuss in the question period. So, of course, in writing Life of Galileo, Brecht, the writer who, in response to the communist East German government's statement that it was disappointed with the people, famously quipped that then it should dissolve it and elect another, was not just concerned to represent the event for its own sake, but rather sought to grasp this momentous historical event as it flashed up in a moment of danger, to use his friend Walter Benjamin's expression. And the specific danger, of course, was then looming. Within months of the completion of this work, the foreign ministers of Germany and the USSR, please make sure your phones are turned off.
Great demonstration.
That's right. Would sign a non-aggression pact, clearing the way for the invasion of Poland. 1 year later, in the year of his suicide, in his theses on the philosophy of history, Walter Benjamin would write that nothing has corrupted the German working class so much as the idea that it was moving with the current of history. The lessons of Galileo and the European Enlightenment that he so influenced are clear to us today, I think, in relation to a left whose dogmatism parallels that of the mid-20th century at an equally dangerous moment in our own history. Those parallels, I think, are important. And of course, we don't have the kind of historicist faith in progress that the left did back then, but we do have a sense that morally we are in the right. They, that is to say the 20th century, mid-20th century left, might have had a sense of historical truth. We on the left today have a sense of moral truth, and it is on that basis that we feel a little compunction about shutting down those with whom we disagree, even when we may, in fact, be on the same side. That is to say, there are other people who share relatively similar interests. They certainly can't be regarded as fascists, but we still want to shut them down because we don't like what they say. We are offended by what they say, and they should not be able to say what they say. This is our situation today. But what Galileo was engaged in was science. And in science, it's possible to postulate with some qualifications progress in our understanding of nature, not to mention our control and domination of it. But is it also possible to speak of progress in morality and art? I think that it is. Still, I think so. It can still be maintained that free speech and expression played and plays a key role in the struggle for gender equality and for LGBTQ plus rights. The expression of gender identity itself is today relatively less encumbered by the prejudices of tradition and religion, although they have not been eliminated, without a doubt, and this is, I'm sure, going to come up. I would expect it to. While there's much equivocation surrounding the significance of the Enlightenment, as in Kant's famous definition, humanity's emergence from self-incurred tutelage, what Marx would in fact later call alienation, that is a condition in which the products of human activity are then elevated above and oppress living, breathing men and women. Its basic slogan was sapere aude, have the courage to know or think for yourself. I would add, even if it offends others. The principle that the individual ought to be able to think and express themselves freely is axiomatic, goes without saying, in the constitutional framework of liberal democracies. But it is under fire insofar as liberal democracy itself is under fire. Today, it is up to us to think for ourselves how we ought to live our lives, how to make and remake our identities, including our gender identities and its expression, in the fullest possible sense, but that the space for actually doing this is becoming ever greater, ever more greatly foreshortened. What about art? Can we talk about progress in art? Art history is a story of transformations over time of what a given civilization or culture is considered to be meaningful, valuable, sublime, and above all, beautiful. Innovation depended on the artist's ability to challenge the existing content and form of art, even at very great risk to themselves. In the Renaissance, for example, both underwent a profound transformation that quickly opened up a chasm between Renaissance and medieval art, although one wouldn't want to emphasize the opposition too much. I'd get into trouble with my colleague Paul Dutton, who wants to see some of the continuities. But we have a chasm here, especially in the realm of painting. At the level of content, religious subjects such as the Virgin Mary, the Passion of the Christ, and other biblical tableaux are relinquished in favor of increasingly secular themes such as the everyday life of commerce, sumptuous portrayals of the considerable and growing wealth of emerging bourgeois, not to mention colonial order, dynamic representations of the hunt, realistic depictions of human anatomy, etc. At the level of form, the new Renaissance painting becomes increasingly based on perspective and the creation of beautiful illusion. Here, at least, there was more or less agreement on the primacy of the aesthetic category of the beautiful. Fast forward to the 20th century, in interwar Europe, in which, on the backdrop of the carnage of the Great War, an aesthetics of beauty is supplanted quickly by an aesthetics of the ugly, as artists sought to hold up to society a mirror of its own bloodied image. After the Second World War, in a similar spirit, Theodore W. Adorno would argue that poetry has the same right to exist inasmuch as the tortured man has the right to scream. That's a paraphrase, not an exact quote. So what I then would like to do now is just go through some of the arguments pro and contra free speech. It's not quite the right way of putting it because nobody's arguing against free speech as a whole, but really pro and contra restrictions on regulation on free speech. That's a rather long section now in the paper, and I think I'm having to watch my time a bit, so I think I will just go through and summarize and read them out. But there is an important set of distinctions that can be drawn here first, or should be drawn before I go into these arguments, pro and contra. Yeah, so these have to do not just with the question of free speech, but the relationship between equality and liberty, and also the relationship between free speech and academic freedom. That's something that I haven't really touched upon so much yet. As Oxford political philosopher Teresa M. Bejan has recently reminded us in the pages of Atlantic Magazine, or Atlantic Monthly, it is important to distinguish between isagoria, literally equals within the agora, which implies the equal right of all members of a democratic political community to speak and to be heard, and parrhesia, literally all saying. The first entails reciprocity within a community of equals. The second entails being able to speak one's mind, willy-nilly, unhindered. As Bejan states, and I quote, in ancient Athens, isagoria described the equal right of citizens to participate in public debate in the democratic assembly. Parrhesia, the license to say what one pleased, how and when one pleased, and to whom. Okay, so you have this opposition. If liberal democracy embodies an insoluble contradiction between the principles of equality and liberty, then isagoria maps onto the democratic principle of equality, parrhesia onto the liberal principle of freedom, understood in negative terms, freedom as constraint. For Michel Foucault, parrhesia was the freedom to speak truth to power. It is, in other words, the right to transgress. These two are, as already suggested, are in tension with one another, but also, one could say, in a certain level of a certain kind of tension with a third concept of speech, which is embedded in the philosophical tradition, which is logos, which is to say ordered speech that entails dialectic, or what Karl Popper will later call, also a philosopher of science, will call a logic of conjecture and refutation. It would seem that the democratic public sphere includes, to different degrees, all three, while the university community would emphasize the first and the third, specifically in terms of governance and inquiry, respectively. So free speech within the public sphere is free speech, free expression, within the university, free inquiry. And the limits of that inquiry, or who is able to participate in that inquiry, is regulated by by the faculties, by professional associations, by journals, and so on. One actually presupposes a certain kind of equality. The other doesn't necessarily, in terms of who gets to count as an academic. So I go through the various arguments. I basically distill them down, and maybe if I'm missing some of them, you can remind me and point them out. But I think that there's essentially three kinds of arguments in favor of free speech. One is based on rules and deontological. One that goes to Kant's view of the way in which we ought to treat other rational beings. That is to say, always as ends and never as simply means to ends. So that grounds a kind of understanding of free speech in terms of this first concept, isogoria. The second one could be understood, and typically this is the antithesis within ethical theory, consequentialism. You judge a particular phenomenon by its effects or its consequences. So free speech here could be understood to be justified in relation to the sum total of good over bad consequences, the sum total of pleasure over pain, a kind of utilitarian calculus. And that we can't really predict where the pursuit of knowledge will take us. Right? We can't predict in advance. We have no way of knowing. And this is also Milton's argument in Areopagitica, that there shouldn't be censorship in advance of books because we really don't know what those books mean yet. Maybe once we've seen the effects and the implications of those books, then it might be possible to argue for censorship, but not in advance. We can't censor in advance. The third argument is really a kind of, I sort of call it a kind of legitimacy argument. So even if we can't agree with either the deontological or the consequentialist kinds of justifications, both of which, by the way, are manifested in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. He draws on both kinds of logics. He's coming right out of a utilitarian tradition, but he's also now really exercised or concerned by Alexis de Tocqueville's problem of the tyranny of the majority, and really wants to carve out a space for individual liberty. And so he comes up with the harm principle, the liberty principle. And this is essentially that one is free to do what one likes as long as one doesn't harm others. I think people are probably quite familiar with this, and I think it's had a huge impact on our legal system, on the way we think about our ethical, moral intuitions. I think it was also prior to Mill articulating this in On Liberty there in the U.S. Constitution. So, but he lays this out in terms of both kinds of logics. Deontological kind of reasoning, consequentialist reasoning. I'd say that even if neither of these two positive justifications work, if you don't accept either of them, maybe the assumptions don't, you can't buy the assumptions of either, and think that, well, that may open the door to a kind of restriction. The question then really leads to who gets to decide. Who gets to decide? And this becomes a big question when we look specifically at the Rushdie fatwa, right? Who is in fact the community that is being insulted and therefore harmed? Who represents the community? So I go through and provide some counter-arguments, and I could sum those up in the following terms, and I've been told that I have to move on. So I could sum those up in the following terms, really questioning the autonomy of the individual, locating the individual, embedding the individual in social relations. What flows from that is that the individual has a responsibility for his or her speech acts, specifically in terms of the problem of harm, which is now redefined in terms of offense. This is one of the things that Mill tries to keep separate and distinct. Harm and offense. These two must be kept separate and distinct in Mill's view, but there's an increasing tendency to want to understand, for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, especially the question of recognition and the damage misrecognition could do to persons, misrecognition, disrespect. These instances of offense could also actually be understood not just as offense that one can brush off easily, but in fact harm to one's sense of self and therefore agency and therefore one's rights. So these are the kinds of reflections that I raise. One of the important arguments, and this is mentioned in my abstract, is that of Herbert Marcuse, who makes a very famous, very controversial argument about the repressive nature of tolerance. And his argument is that tolerance was a really revolutionary idea in the 19th century when capitalism was really consolidating itself, and you had open contradictions in society that could lead in a number of different directions. In particular, there was the possibility of what figures like Marcuse and others working in that tradition would call the negation of the negation, right? So the negativity of capitalist society could itself generate its own negativity, that is to say, what Marx calls capitalism's, or the bourgeoisie's, grave diggers. So socialism was very much on the horizon. It seemed to be possible to think about socialism emerging organically out of capitalist society. With the developments of the early part of the 20th century, the failure of the German, the Russian Revolution, with the consolidation of capitalism after the Second World War, you have an increasingly totalized structure in which those seemingly radical contradictions within a society that would point beyond them no longer do. What they do is simply reinforce the existing order. And so what Marcuse's argument is that allowing for a kind of context in which there is there's as much freedom as possible for speech and expression, you don't actually have the possibility of this challenging the powers that be, challenging the overall structure of society, but only deepening its hold by, in a sense, legitimizing those structures by saying, look, we have plenty of freedom. You can point to any number of forces in society that seem to represent this. It's a contradictory position, and as I've said elsewhere, I've written a little piece on Marcuse's argument with Adorno over the occupation by the students in Frankfurt of the offices of the Institute for Social Research. Marcuse thinks that this isn't such a bad thing, and Adorno is opposed to it. And I think this leads, in a sense, to certain leads in a very potentially authoritarian direction. So I think that has to be challenged. I'll just come to my conclusions now, and that is that the burden of proof at the end of the day to give free speech as wide a purview as possible is to suggest that the harm that's claimed by vulnerable groups is serious. It has to be taken with the utmost viewed with the utmost importance, but at the same time, it is vital to be aware of what the implications are for opening up or for creating the context in which there are greater restrictions. One of the things about our worry about hate speech is that often hate speech doesn't manifest itself as such. One of the things I put in my conclusion is that one can open a newspaper and see headlines that run to the effect that we are being swamped by migrants and refugees and so on. This can't in any way be understood to constitute hate speech, but yet you see a proliferation of such forms. So there are limits in terms of what can actually be legislated against in this respect. That's what I had put in my paper, but I think just yesterday morning, National Post ran with exactly that headline. And if people saw this, Toronto, City of Toronto faces a tide of migrants. Right? That is damaging. That is the kind of speech that is a prelude to genocide. It cannot necessarily be legislated against. It has to be confronted by other means. It has to be confronted by arguments, by critique, by exposure, right? So that's one argument. Censoring, legalizing speech can be said to disarm it, but it can also be said to further weaponize it by making it dangerous, by making it, giving it a mystique, and giving it a power that it might not have had. And this is why you've had communities like the gay community and the black community, and I think now the disabled rights community, that take words that have been used against them as epithets and turn those words into means of defense. Right? Queer, for example, the word crip, it seems to be used in this way. I think this is a strategy that Judith Butler defends, I believe, in Excitable Speech. This is quite important. I think there's also the argument about driving hate speech underground, where it festers and can't be aired and addressed directly. Creating a censorious environment on the left, and there's no doubt that there has been a censorious environment on the left for some time under the guise of social justice, identity politics, and so on. And maybe, perhaps for some good reasons. I don't want to dismiss it. But one of the effects, whether you agree with it or not, one of the effects is surely it will drive young people away from the left. It will drive some young people away from the left. It'll make them apolitical if it doesn't actually push them to the right. That's not good in the long run for counteracting hate. The last point, and I think that the major argument that I'm making in this constellation of shorter essays, is that one of the things that the left has emphasized less and less with its greater foregrounding of identity questions is the problem of inequality. And I think that at the end of the day, if we're really focused only on censorship, only on curtailing freedom of speech and expression, only on protecting people from offense, which in some cases might well be justified, but if that's our only focus, we're treating the symptoms and we're not dealing with the disease. What is the nature of the disease? We need to talk more about that. My intuition is it has got something to do with the growing inequality around us and what certain political forces are doing in terms of presenting that reality to society. And I don't see enough pushback there from our side. So there are a few other things that I want to get into, but I'll leave it there and we can open that up in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. Lots of things to discuss. Now we are going to move into the response by Morgane Ogre. Morgane Ogre is the executive director of the Morgane Ogre Foundation, which works to narrow the gap between human rights laws and as they are written and as they are experienced by Canadians. Morgane Ogre was the BC NDP candidate in the then BC Liberal stronghold of Vancouver Falls Creek during 2017 general election. Working across party lines, Ogre has become recognized as an effective community organizer and educator, changing hearts and minds to help win significant change on issues focused around equality, LGBTQ2+, inclusion, and accessible education. Ogre has helped shape Canada's human rights law, right policies, improve healthcare delivery, pen policy for K-12 education, prevent extrajudicial deportations overseas, protect trans youth in schools, and formulate national transgender policy. Previously on the City of Vancouver LGBTQ2+ Advisory Committee and on the Vancouver District Parent Advisory Council, where she served as chair. Ogre volunteers on the Vancouver Police Department, the LGBTQ Q2+, advisory group with Women Against Violence Against Women, WAVA, and mentors aspiring young politicians with intersectional experiences. Welcome, Morgane.
Thank you. Can you hear in the back? Do you need a speaker, right? I can take this one, actually, the handheld. I've got some experience with handheld speakers. Thank you very much for having me today. When I try to describe what I do, I think that the shortest thing is I try to set precedents in courts that forever stop people from hating on others in a way that I disapprove. So the foundation works to narrow the gap between our laws and the application on the ground. We're specifically focused on marginalized communities. Currently, we're supporting...
Yeah, this isn't Morgane. It's not up there.
How do we do that?
What do we need to do?
We're going to do something here. Currently, we're supporting a case where I'm a complainant in the Human Rights Tribunal, Ogre v. Wallach, which seeks to address specifically hate speech. So actually, I have skin in the game in the question of hate speech against free speech and about where the constraints are. Huh.
Yeah, this is...
Oh well, I'll use my slides and I get to see them.
Sorry,
If you go to my Twitter, well, you won't go to my Twitter account. What happened to your show? Isn't that like a print screen? How do you switch screens?
Yeah, I don't know.
Anyways,
Control.
I work in the world of applied freedom and justice.
Oh, maybe that's it.
Rather than in the world of theoretical justice and injustice. And in particular, I focus on a little bit the opposite problem than Samir focuses on. I focus not on the freedom for the minority voice to be heard to bring out new ideas, but the protection of the minority population from people exercising their rights to talk, to oppress and crush the communities. And this is a real problem. 2 weeks ago, a friend of mine died of suicide. She died of suicide because her laptop got hacked. You'd think one would have the resilience to survive something like this. But of course, she was coming from an experience where she's been living under oppression in every step of her life. Incident after incident after incident. Before her laptop was crashed, she suffered profound discrimination in a hospital in Vancouver. Before that, she was in a hospital to deal with chronic pain that was related to a car accident, where she was distracted by a hateful incident that involved people speaking to her in a horrible, horrible way and caused her to be distracted, and she ran a red light and got into a terrible accident. She was here in British Columbia because she had fled from Nova Scotia, where she had been essentially drummed out of her job as an apprentice, as an electrician, because of transphobia at the workplace. All of this comes from people speaking their mind. And some people speak their mind foolishly, but some people go further than that, and they do it viciously, and they do it viciously on purpose. And I'm here to kind of talk about why we have limits on speech, or the kinds of limits we have. First of all, let's talk about limits we have in life. There are speed limits in life. There are limits on property damage. We can't go and do whatever we want. We can't just take whatever we want, whenever we want to. We can't kick people, or worse. And we have limits on polygamy, right? Strangely, we don't have limits on polyamory, but we have limits on polygamy. And in British Columbia, we have the Human Rights Code. I'll try to be really quick, which basically says you can't publish or issue or display bad things, right? Statements, publications, notices, signs, symbols, and emblems that A, indicate discrimination or an intention to discriminate against a person or a group or a class, or B, is likely to expose people to discrimination or hatred or contempt because of the protected attributes. We've got this enumerated list of things you can't publish garbage about people about. Now, of course, It doesn't apply to private communication. I can send a hateful email about various people, and it's protected. It's also, this is just publications, it's not speech. In Canada, we have something similar, advocating genocide. I think we all understand why that's important, right? Advocating or promoting genocide. Sometimes people get overly obsessed with one specific genocide, which was horrible, beyond horrible, but there have been many genocides. And some of them have been quick and dirty and fast, and we haven't thought about them as genocide well enough. But you know, the systematic eradication of a community because of who they are, that's a genocide, right? It doesn't have to all happen on a Tuesday. It could take years, but it's still a genocide. We talk about the First Nations cultural genocide. We talk about the 60s coup as being part of a genocide. It's important to appreciate that this stuff, that such things can be far-reaching. Public incitement of hatred. Mr. Wallach of Ogre v. Wallach is actually facing criminal charges under 319.1. He was arrested a few days ago for his actions in Pride Parade in Ontario. It's interesting to me that he did the exact same actions against me, doesn't face criminal charges here, but that's for another day. Anyways, inciting hatred likely to lead to a breach of the peace. It's, you know, interestingly enough, the test is breach of the peace, which is very hard to define. And finally, the willful promotion of hatred. You know, other than in, of course, private conversation, promoting hatred is a bad, bad thing. There's also a little bit about mischief, which I thought I'd throw in here because actions, you know, like for example, carving something into a door is a form of communication in reality, and that falls under mischief, motivated by, you know, actions motivated by bias, prejudice, and hatred. So basically doing dirty tricks or damage to things is part of expression, it's part of speech. And keeping on going. So there's precedent for this. People don't quite appreciate that there's a solid Supreme Court precedent in Saskatchewan versus Bill Wallach and a whole bunch of other people, which you know, it's a very big list of people and organizations. But it actually said that using expressions that expose a group to hatred, hate speech seeks to delegitimize groups in the eyes of the majority, reducing their social standing and acceptance in society. This was part of the ruling. Hate speech, therefore, rises beyond causing distress to individual group members. It can have a societal impact. It lays the groundwork for broad attacks on vulnerable groups that can range from discrimination to ostracism to creating the situation for suicidality to segregation, deportation, and in extreme cases, it goes to genocide. And we know this. We've all studied World War II. We all know how this was set up. We know how genocides were set up in other places through speech. It wasn't set up through a gradual increase of violence. Usually it's a sudden outburst of terrible behavior based on what people have been saying. And this is the issue. When you're in a very, very small community, transgender people, we're 1/3 of the population. We're as rare, roughly, as natal twins, except that we also suffer from bias. And of course, other communities suffer from bias and stigma, and people speak freely about how we're wrong somehow, just like other people. And it's very, very important to have limits on free speech. So this was about distributing flyers, and ultimately what the Supreme Court ruled was that passages of these flyers combined many of the hallmarks of hatred identified in case law, because we have case law about what hatred looks like. It has to be pathologizing, it has to be demonizing, or it has to be associating people with a vilified population. For example, pedophiles. You know, if we say iPhone users are pedophiles, that's hate speech. But iPhone users are not a protected class, so you couldn't follow up on it. The expression portrays the targeted group as a menace that threatens the safety and well-being of others, makes reference to respected sources in an effort to lend credibility to the negative generalizations, and uses vilifying and derogatory representation to create a tone of hatred. That's what hate speech is. Saying, you know, your science is wrong isn't hate speech, but saying you are all pedophiles because you're in this room, that's hate speech. pedophiles is an easy target, I know. Their conclusion, it was not unreasonable for the tribunal to conclude that the expression was more likely than not to expose homosexuals to hatred. Of course, this was a ruling, so it wasn't a Supreme Court ruling. So, show and tell. From my life in the last 12 months. Free speech or hatred? That was an attack on me in my writing when I was running. Actually, it was before I ran. Reasonable arguments about how trans women are predators and were being passed around to try to give a reasoned argument why human rights law shouldn't apply to us. KKK flyers distributed in Abbotsford. This one was picked up by a friend of mine on his front lawn. A mixture of leaning on religion and leaning on demonization. Anti-Chinese sentiment in the Vancouver area last month related to demonizing a population based on some of them have bought homes, some homes are expensive and therefore Chinese people are bad, something like that. It's hate speech, rallies with signs and posters, don't mess with our children, stop, sex isn't fun, parents have rights. It's innocuous enough, except that it's underlying on some very, very significant hatred. For example, the idea that talking about the existence of gender identity or sexual orientation violates a parent's right to have their children never know that this exists and messes with the children by making them queer, right? So it is actually pathologizing signage. At the same sign, international Jews are behind sexual orientation, gender identity, and kids' education. That's a really good one. He was following me around trying to tell me about them. All the them. And finally, let's talk about the consequences, right? So I deal in anti-trans violence and so forth. The consequences, this is a proportion of young trans youth, ages 16 to 24 in Ontario from a few years ago, talking about their outcomes. And really, the important thing here is the different columns. The column on the left, the dark blue one, is people who are supported by their family and their community. And the light blue one is the people who are ostracized, youth. Okay, so the first one is satisfaction with life. Second one is excellent physical health. Third one is excellent mental health. Fourth one is high self-esteem. Do we see a pattern here? When you're ostracized, when you allow people to spew hatred in writing and in social media and so forth, it has consequences. People actually get hurt. It causes deaths. Kids, for example, in my community, I really follow this really well. Kids who we allow to be subjected to hatred are have a 1 in 3 chance of not making it through high school. They kill themselves. If they're protected, they have the resilience of the other kids. And this is just hard data that's irrefutable. Finally, there's a trend in Canada. Hate-motivated crimes, even though there are very few, have been steadily increasing. Now, this is only looking 4 years back. I don't know what 2017 and 2018, but I know 2017 is further of an increase. We need to manage hatred. We can't stop people from having feelings and beliefs, but we can manage how they communicate it. And there's a big difference between me saying, I think iPhone users are bad people because they do dumb things because iPhones are a tool of the week, and me saying iPhone users are pedophiles. These are two completely different ways of saying things. And that's why we have hate speech laws, to manage how people communicate. And ultimately, when we create bias, we create stigma. Stigma creates harm. Harm creates alienation. Alienation creates delinquency or this engagement, which causes more bias, which causes more stigma. And it's a vicious circle. If we manage how people communicate with each other and prohibit the extremist behavior, we can actually really manage the health of communities. And this is very, very important to us because everybody here one day will be a taxpayer. It's much cheaper to prevent than to repair. I think just that on its own is a good argument. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Morgane. Thank you. Our last respondent is Josh Paterson. He's a lawyer and the executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association. Josh got his start acting as the director of the Freedom of Expression, Equality and Dignity project at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association in Toronto. After moving to Vancouver, in the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Coast Salish peoples, he joined a BC union-side labor and human rights practice and spent much of his time working on one of the BC largest racial discrimination cases in history. Josh's career as a lawyer has focused on protecting some of the most marginalized people from human rights violations, civil liberties restriction, discrimination, and environmental injustice. He has worked for several years as a lawyer for First Nations in their fights to protect their constitutional rights and their inherent legal authority. His work has included law reform and policy advocacy, public education, community organizing, government relationship, and litigation. Josh holds law and master's degrees from the University of Toronto and clerk at Ontario's Superior Court of Justice. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Samir for the presentation, and it's a real honor to sit here with you, Morgane, who I've admired your civic leadership for a really long time, and so I'm really glad to be here with you tonight. I just want to share in the acknowledgement that we're here in the unceded territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And when I'm talking about the law today, and charter rights and stuff like that, I want to acknowledge that I'm talking about the law and rights within settler society. By doing that, I recognize that that society is imposed by force on another society, on another legal order that I'm not expert to speak on, but I wanted to recognize that that's what I'm doing when I'm talking about our law. I'll also recognize that what is obvious perhaps to most of you in the room, that I'm someone who is never subjected to discriminatory remarks. To racism, to gender discrimination. I've happened by the accident of my birth into a great many advantages, and while I may have struggles, none of those are on account of my skin color, my gender expression, or my sexual orientation. So that's something that I certainly recognize as I sit here and pontificate about the harms that are done to others and how we ought to respond to them. The BCCLA, really briefly, is a human rights organization that's been operating here in BC for more than half a century. Some things that we've been involved in addition to freedom of expression, is the recent case finding solitary confinement unconstitutional in federal prisons. Last week's complaint against carding at the VPD for discrimination against Indigenous and Black folks. Working on issues to do with the border and refugee rights here in the country. And of course, longstanding work on LGBTQI equality and trans plus rights, including one of our biggest victories of our existence, which lay at the intersection of LGBTQI equality rights and freedom of expression, which was the Little Sisters case. Which we took all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada on behalf of a queer bookstore here in Vancouver that was waging a fight against Canada Customs, who had deemed arbitrarily a great proportion of its materials to be obscene and harmful just because the government and the officials of the day didn't like it and thought it was gross. And so would destroy or stop shipments of everything from pornography through to stories and all kinds of different material that was coming to Little Sisters. We fought that to the Supreme Court of Canada with Little Sisters, and ultimately we won a ruling that they had been singled out by customs officials for arbitrary censorship by the government. So the BCCLA's position in this dilemma is that we, the association, considers, and I think this is no surprise, that the willful attempt to promote hatred against any identifiable group is immoral and is to be fought against. But we also argue that expressions that form part of those attempts should be largely protected from legal sanction, and there's reasons for that. It's clear that the accumulation of vilifying and derogatory comments can and do create an atmosphere of shame. They can result in the silencing of targeted groups and individuals. Hate speech, as Morgane has shown this evening very powerfully, can and does create real harm. It can make people more susceptible to physical attacks and other discrimination. It is very serious in that it strikes at the recognition of individuals and groups as equal participants in our community. And the question for the BC Civil Liberties Association has never been about whether something ought to be done about it. The association's answer has always unequivocally been yes. Something should be done. The question for us is what that thing is that should be done. And the great concern for our association over time, flowing directly from our work and the evidence in our work, is that we are very concerned and afraid about the use of the coercive power of the state as the go-to solution, because we're very fearful of the potential consequences and harms that can come from that state overreach and from those responses. So why is it that the BCCLA says that? It is because it comes from a concern to protect democracy. We could get into a lot more John Stuart Mill things and other philosophers. I think you've covered that very well this evening. I don't need to get into that. Well, let me go through a few examples. So, last summer there was a lot of public conversation of these issues in town after what had happened in Charlottesville in the United States, and I bet a lot of people in here would remember that there was going to be an anti-immigration rally here in Vancouver. Wound up being virtually non-existent, but there was going to be an anti-immigration rally, and of course there was a massive counter-rally in which we participated, which was a celebration of equality and inclusion and was really a powerful denunciation of hatred and racism, which I appreciate doesn't happen every day and doesn't happen in the many atomized individual instances where people are discriminated against. But in the media, it was reported at the time that there were some people demanding that the city shut down the anti-immigrant rally before it even happened. Some had said that people ought to be arrested on site for showing up. This was reported in the papers before they'd even uttered any words, merely based on an idea as to what it was that they might be saying. Some were suggesting that the city responded, well, our hate speech laws don't allow us to do that. And some responded by saying, well, they ought to be expanded then. If the law doesn't actually stop them from speaking, the law should, and so we should be talking about expanding the law. And we found those arguments to be troubling because we've been dealing, particularly in recent years, with attempts by the government to attack free speech in a whole range of areas. One example was the fight against Bill C-51, which many folks in this room might have been engaged in, might have been marching against it and signing petitions and all kinds of things. And folks may remember that included, for example, new prohibitions and expanded prohibitions on speech, a new crime of promoting terrorism in general, very vague. As Morgane has showed us this evening, the laws that prohibit hate speech right now in Canada are actually fairly narrowly tailored. I mean, you can say racist things, you can say them on a stage, that doesn't get you there. You have to be willfully promoting hatred, which involves a real high level of vilification, almost an incitement. But in C-51, it wasn't nearly as narrow as that. It was terrorism in general. And we and many others denounced that law, and probably lots of folks in here denounced that law, because it made it impossible in some cases. It was theorized that the scope of it made it impossible to even get into discussions to understand people's views, or to talk about resistance efforts against oppressive governments elsewhere. That if you were objecting to the takeover of Crimea in Ukraine by the Putin government, and arguing for saying that you supported the resistance of that by armed means, that technically you could come within the ambit of C-51, you could fall under C-51 and actually be breaking the law. We have very similar concerns about moves to, or suggestions that the prohibitions against hate speech in Canada as they are now ought to be expanded, which isn't actually what Morgane has necessarily said, so I'm not trying to make a straw person out of anyone's argument. But there are these arguments that what we have isn't enough, that they ought to be expanded, and we're concerned about it because we have tended to learn through our work over and over that criminalizing a broader range of speech and ideas, things that we find abhorrent and terrible, don't necessarily make people safer. Progressive folks may remember, and this is going back a ways, I was a kid then, so I don't remember this at the time, but academic at UBC, Sunera Tobani, was threatened with a hate speech prosecution under the existing laws because she basically said that the US government had blood on its hands, and that was partly why 9/11 was happening, was because of US interventions abroad and US brutality abroad over many years that was creating the circumstances in which these attacks might happen. And BCCLA was one of the groups that defended her at the time from this use by the prosecutors of this law to try and silence her. Much of the work that we've done and advice we give around hate speech laws comes from folks who are working in the Palestinian rights movement, who are concerned about and working on BDS, who are being accused on their campuses and in places they're working, boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in relation to Israel, who are habitually under threat from allegations of hate speech, being excluded from events because they're perceived to be anti-Semitic, and having motions passed against them by the House of Commons saying that their speech is unacceptable. In the United States, too, we see threats levied against progressives and those on the left all the time, including and especially focused on communities of color and the vulnerable. The president saying that black athletes should be fired for engaging in protest, for example. Not hate speech per se, but him using his pulpit as the head of state to condemn those people, to condemn news outlets that he deems to be fake, and to ask for investigations of those outlets. They did try and convicted a protester of color who laughed during the Senate confirmation of Attorney General Jeff Sessions. It was overturned on appeal, but only after she had been prosecuted, and successfully prosecuted. The ACLU too reports that one of the things they hear about the most in relation to these issues in the United States is to do with censorship in relation to those advocating for Palestinian rights. Calls for Black Lives Matter and water protesters on the Dakota Access Pipeline to be listed as domestic terrorists, with all of the things that go along with that. Here in Canada, organizers and demonstrators against Enbridge and Kinder Morgan pipeline actively being surveilled by the RCMP and CSIS. I am actually by law prevented from talking with you about the complaint the BCCLA filed about CSIS spying on Enbridge activists in this way. Because as part of the process of complaining, the state spy authorities have seen fit to subject me to a legal gag order so that I can't talk about any of the evidence or the allegations that I made against a spy agency. I can't tell you what it is I think they did. I can't tell you what I told the judge about what I thought they were up to. I'm just not allowed, or I could be prosecuted. We are challenging that order, by the way. So we'll see where that gets to. But the government, in our view, has historically used its raw power to try and silence people who speak truth to power. Historically, it's been progressives who fought to expand free speech guarantees, to fight for equality, to fight for LGBTQI plus expression, to do their art, to fight for the right of people to challenge government. And there's no question it's easier to enjoy free speech when you're privileged. And I think that that's that free speech advocates, particularly white ones, often forget that, or maybe they don't get clipped that way in the news. They'll say, well, you don't have a right to be free from offense. Never talking about the fact that, no, there's actual harm, and we need to recognize that. Or never being particularly self-critical about how easy it is for a white male academic to carry on about the importance of free speech when others are actively being denied their ability to participate in those same discourses. Of course, those rights fall more greatly in favor of those who are privileged, but we don't think the answer is to restrict that. We think the answer is to try and find ways to ensure that the voices that are being suppressed also have the ability to have those rights. And so to conclude, the other thing, just to say that more coercive regulation isn't the answer, then begs the question, well, what is the answer? And that's another thing that I think oftentimes those who are defending free speech either don't include in what they're saying, or maybe don't get clipped by the media in what they're saying. I think it's a place where sometimes folks who advocate for free speech fall down. And we think that, at least where we focus our effort, is on work to build the legal infrastructure that is required to help protect and to strengthen those who are subjected to discrimination. For us as an organization, to the extent of our power, to react powerfully against discrimination. So strengthening the legal system to reduce the incidence of discrimination and hate. Creating, in BC's case, a human rights commission, which other provinces have, to do the advocacy, education, and critically research on the incidence of discrimination in other provinces and territories that we just don't have here. Try and bring a carding complaint against the police when there are no stats from any agency about what's happening. Finally, someone managed to get some, and we filed a complaint, but it's been very difficult. In Ontario, they've got report after report after report on racial profiling because they have a human rights commission. So strengthening the capacity to document discrimination and strengthening the capacity of community to advocate strongly against discrimination. And I appreciate that that doesn't necessarily immediately solve the problem for the individual person who is being subjected to that. And I think that's something that we need to think about. We can't just say these things. We need to make sure that they're actually effective, and it needs to be documented that they're effective in doing that. Otherwise, it's not much of an answer. But it can't be the case that if the state's not going to impose penalties on these people for saying these things, unless it gets to this really difficult level, the state shouldn't also just be gone fishing and taking a pass on it, as largely it has been here in BC for the last number of years. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure there's going to be lots of interesting discussion and question. Thank you. Okay, sure.
Yeah, I would like to invite the audience to pose your questions, but because we are recording this event, I'm going to ask you to come here to the podium here with the microphone. It will be a time in which you probably engage in answering, because there's an interesting dialectic that we can kind of pose in this dichotomy between silence and speech, with all the nuances of power and the legal situations. But is there anyone in the audience that wants to open the conversation with the panelists? if could you mind
Or can
coming
we-
here?
maybe I think that would be the best. It's kind of hard to get up.
I really came here to listen about the SLAPP suits, and I don't know if you guys said anything about it, or did I miss it?
Didn't say anything,
Why didn't you?
because I ran out of time.
Well, we'll give you 10 minutes. Please, they're very important.
Sure.
You know, they're absolutely important because there's such a thing as nobody's going to demonstrate or do anything if they think their house is going to get taken. Their children's university won't be paid. They get their jobs are going to be lost. You know what I meant? I think that's more important than I don't know what, but it is important.
Can I say something very quickly? Could I say something very quickly before you give the proper answer? And that would be one of the things that we've done here at the Institute is organized a number of talks on SLAPP suits. I had a colleague of mine come in from University of Guelph to talk about his book on SLAPP suits. Just to say something quite closely related to that and something that Josh mentioned, we've done several things on Bill C-51. I think one of the best events we've ever had was a 350-person event that was an expert panel on C-51, and Josh's colleague Michael Vaughan was there, and it was fantastic. We had Craig Forsese, who is one of the two main legal experts on this law. So these are things that are very front and center to us. I'm glad you raised them, and thank you for raising the question. Josh?
I'll be very brief. Well, I know that, but there's everyone else in the room too. The nice thing about anti-SLAPP suits is that we're going to have legislation here in the province of British Columbia finally to regulate SLAPP suits. So in a sense, all of the work and activism that's led up to that has, knocking on wood that it passes the legislature, and that the legislature holds together long enough to actually do it. But the legislation will be passed, and for those who may not know, SLAPP suits are when a company, for example, sues you because you've spoken out against something they're doing. You're talking on a matter of the public interest, but they sue you because you're affecting their economic relations and so forth. And we've seen that in Kinder Morgan. We've seen that on lots of other developments around the province, where people are really afraid to speak up, to write letters to the editor, to go to city council and talk about stuff because they don't want to get sued. And the new legislation will mean that it doesn't mean people can't still sue you or try, but instead of having to go through the whole trial and spend tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars defending yourself as to why you weren't actually libeling them or whatever, there'll be now a more quick and efficacious way of having those suits dismissed if they have the effect on you of interfering with your freedom of speech on a matter of the public interest. So that's new from the provincial government, and we're very pleased with it.
It's based on the Quebec legislation, right?
Based largely on the Quebec legislation and on sort of there was a uniform, there were some academics who basically wrote a uniform law, a model law. There's Ontario's law as well. Anyways, as far as we can tell, it's the best. It will be, when passed, the strongest legislation in the country.
The previous legislation was actually drafted by our current president, Andrew Patter, when he was Justice Minister in the province.
Morgane, please.
Okay, yes. So, indeed, the anti-SLAPP suit legislation was put forward by government on the 15th of May, when there's no reason to think it's not going to pass at this time, and so it's positive. I wanted to highlight, though, that, as soon as that legislation was proposed, my opponent in Ogre v. Wadcott proposed that I was involved in a SLAPP suit. So it was used immediately against our case. It was, we beat it down, but all legislation has a double edge, always. There's always a downside to every law. Now, people will say the thing is a SLAPP suit every single time, and then you'll have to address that at an additional cost. I wanted to also, though...
It won't apply to human rights
complaints.
It
won't apply to human rights complaints, that's right.
You would have had to sue him in court.
Right. But in human rights, which is a lot of what this is about, I'm struck by how long it took for my little case to get to a hearing. The hearing is tentatively scheduled for mid-September, which is roughly a year and a half after the complaint was made. And I happen to have the might of, a legal team behind me. But if I had been on my own in what I'm doing, I would never have survived. Even just the simplest human rights complaint to a tribunal saying this person did something really mean. A problem that we have here that I'm aware of is just the amount of time and effort it takes to get heard. This is really unfair that people need to get high quality lawyers to argue just as simple as human rights law.
Thank you for the range of views here today. I want to push or try and get Morgane and Samir to do a little dance here around the question of what works, and I mean, especially sort of like the argument that the light of discourse and argument does a better job in dealing with hate speech or offensive speech, in the way that Josh pointed out. Our Vancouver is so multicultural. A demonstration against the anti-immigration demonstration, and this specifically around this. So my native informant in the Reddit world, which is to say my 17-year-old son, tells me that whenever Reddit shuts down the incel and red pill and so on, all these forums which are sites of virulent and misogynistic and transphobic and racist and so on hatred and speech around gender issues and very many others. When those forums themselves are shut down by Reddit, so that's not even the state. That's actually a private organization that's shutting down. So that kind of, if we want to call it censorship, then what happens is those people don't stop being virulent, hatred-filled, misogynistic, basement-dwelling, blah, blah, blah. Rather, they just go on to other fora and start other fora and so on and so forth, which is to say that thing goes, if we want to use a spatial metaphor, it goes further underground. And so if what we want is for people who hold those views, I don't want to dismiss the people who hold those views, and I would rather see them engaging in debate with others. And maybe I'm naive here, but I think sometimes that debate can lead to people changing their points of view, rather than shutting them down. So if we want people to change their points of view so they do not engage in not only hateful speech, but hateful actions and violent actions and actions that cause harm and not simply offense to others, do we think whether it's state or private censorship is going to do that work? I don't think anyone in this room disagrees that kind of language and that kind of speech can lead to horrible activities and can lead to the kind of suicidal ideation that Morgane talked about. But is the shutting down of that speech by the state or by private, I don't want to just hold up the state here, is that what we think will stop that kind of activity? And just a bit of clarification both from Morgane and from Samir, please.
So I thank you very much, Clint. That was a really excellent question. I think you could probably infer what my answer would be, but I'd be very clear about it. I think that there should be an attempt to bring those ideas into the light of day. I think what you're signaling here, just parenthetically, is a really crucial question, and that is, what has social media done to discourse? I think this is I think you're writing a book on it, right? This is a huge question because you have people like Milo Yiannopoulos who make their names, who made his name on Gamergate. Right? Gamergate is this explosion of virulent misogyny directed against this one woman who is a video game critic and wrote an unfavorable review of a particular game, and it just, the shit hit the fan. So I think we really have to attend to the specificity of this virtual space. I think that's important. But I think, at the same time, I think when people are in a face-to-face discussion, people are much more inhibited. I think Freud's social psychology would be very useful here in terms of understanding the almost hypnotic effect of the virtual environment, the elimination or reduction of inhibitions and the kinds of things that people are then permitting themselves to do or feel permitted to do. That has to be addressed. I think that argumentation, yes, but if you actually talk to social psychologists about engaging in arguments with real authoritarians, it's counterproductive activity because it's taken as weakness and it only deepens their authoritarianism. But I think we need to figure out who are real authoritarians and who are just like kids trying to figure themselves out, trying to figure out the world and their place in it. And if we're too quick to dismiss them or brand them as far-right, alt-right, or whatever, then we're in big trouble. So that's one thing. So yeah, there are limitations to argumentation. The second very basic point is that we need to call out the right as defenders of free speech. They're not. They don't defend free speech. Richard Spencer made it very clear, and I think in the actions of right-wing organizations, in the contradictions that they get embroiled in, like Jordan Peterson, saying he's an advocate of free speech, but all these various faculties, including faculties of law, should be shut down. This is pretty clear, right? It's cynical. It's a cynical use of free speech. Morgane.
So, I've been dogpiled on social media so many times. And it's a quandary. Should people be allowed to lie anonymously and use botnets to attack people? How is that okay, but if they do it in person, I can sue them for libel? What's so special about social media? I do recognize that anonymity provides some protection for people who want to make a better world, change things. You want to be able to do some things anonymously, and some things require anonymity, like voting, for example. But how is it that someone gets to, in my face, scheme to identify where my children live while threatening me, while I'm not supposed to have recourse to this? How is it that that we say social media is a place where we create a lab of ideas, but actually the lab is being manipulated by vested interests who pay to have people set up botnets to attack you? How is it that I find myself in conversations with one person on 5 accounts that amplify each other in order to access my 500,000 to 1 million views a month? Because they see me as a target, they see me as a high-value target, and so they spend money to attack me and to discredit me. I noticed that almost all of the anonymous coward attacks come from overseas. I noticed that when people have their name associated to their Twitter account or anything else, they are so much more polite, right? And I noticed that when I'm running as a politician and I have an army of lawyers at my side, or the idea that there's a machine protecting me, that I'm not just one vulnerable person that you can crush, people are so much better. So I do value freedom. I recognize that revolutions have to be done in secret and identities have to be protected. But I do not understand why we hold up the ability of anonymous cowards to attack victims that have done nothing to them and do it without any consequence whatsoever, except their feelings being hurt when we take away their Twitter account.
Can I respond real quickly to that? Now, some of the kinds of things that are described when they're threatening are against the law and properly against the law. They're crimes. And there's a question as to whether or not the state is focusing, has caught up with the technology to focus the right kind of energy on protecting people from those sorts of things. I want to recognize that I think we do need to think very hard, and associations like the one I work for need to think very hard and continuously rethink as technology evolves, whether our arguments continue to stand up. Arguments, that may have been designed when there was a different kind of discourse, when discourse operated in different ways, when harms occurred at different intensities and in different ways. We've seen mounting suggestion, and maybe there's evidence, maybe there's not, that it seems like there's evidence that democracy itself has been subverted south of the border and in some other countries by targeted campaigns. You're talking about botnets and these kinds of things. With orchestrated and unchallenged falsehoods that are being marshaled. They're not being debated. They're being consumed wholesale by huge masses of people, and we're only beginning to see the contours of that, and we're nowhere close to understanding what the implications are. And so I do think we need to think very carefully about how our arguments hold up to the extent to which they do in the face of these new ways of communicating and the new implications of that. And that's something that I know that we'll be thinking about quite a lot over the next few years at the BCCLA.
So I'd like to address the fact that by having a panel that is uniform politically, you've actually created a hostile environment for free speech in this room. I have taken careful notes, and I would be happy to take all three of you on a point-by-point basis, and could agree with almost everything that you disagree with almost everything that you said, and point out exactly how, in each instance, you're doing exactly what you showed in that video clip when you said this is the whole point, assuming where the truth is going to take us. So that's the whole issue with the progressive agenda. It begins with saying we acknowledge that we're on the unceded territory, and it goes all the way through, again, point by point. Every time we mention a certain issue, a certain group, every time we tell a certain joke, express the derogatory opinions about a certain person or a certain type of politics or a certain position. And so in the end effect, the environment in the room is hostile to free speech. And that to me is the paradox of the left discussing free speech, is that the left always assumes that we know where we're going. We're going to a more equal, we're going to utopia. I mean, utopianism is at the heart of left-wing politics and left-wing theory and left-wing philosophy. And so we're going to a point of greater equality. We're going to a place of greater, whatever agenda you want to, whatever identity, politics, social justice issue you want to put. And so I could, any point that I would take any of you on about, I have a feeling, I mean, I don't know if there are other people in the room who have critical thoughts, but they can't be expressed here.
Please do.
No, what I'd actually like to talk, because that's a waste of time, right?
No,
because that just puts in person what Morgane's just expressed happens on social media, and there's no point bringing that into the room and doing it over. We can all do that on Twitter anytime, and many of us do. But I want to discuss. I want the question to say, if you create an environment where you believe you know where you're going, can you ever answer the free speech paradox?
Well, can I just answer? I mean,
by all means, there was a question.
I'm going to take the mic because I took it before you answer.
No, I'd like to hear
well,
first, actually.
Okay.
I'd like to go in order, please.
I've got a microphone here. So 1, 2, 3. So I would challenge the premise of your comment, which is to say that the left knows where it's going. I mean, I think that the various points I made, starting from the clip, is that we don't know where the truth will lead. That's why you have to, where possible, maximize the scope for discussion, debate, and of course, dissent. That's far from a utopic position. In fact, if you look at some of the other things that I've written, I argue for a kind of hegemonic politics, an alliance-based politics where there has to be negotiation and there has to be give and take, which I think identity politics, social justice politics, precludes. Because you know in advance who you will and you will not work with. And there are those who are morally beneath you and those who are at your level, morally speaking. You'll work with those who are morally at your level and not with the others. I'm at a complete loss as to what you're saying. So, sorry.
Okay, Morgane?
Okay, so I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer. I don't come from the arts. I come from the hard sciences, which tend to be binary in their interpretation of right and wrong, or true and false, or observed and not observed, right? I really struggle with the passing around of this concept of the left and the right, When I was trying to get trans equality passed in Canada, I worked side by side with the Conservative Party's queers in order to get them to get me in front of their own crew so that we could have a polite conversation about how to manage their extremist social conservatives. It's not a left and right thing. It has more to do with a goal and an intent. And when we try to get to that goal, we find the people who are likely to be our allies or the people who are likely to be swayed by our views. And now I work in the evidence-based world, right? If there's the evidence that says something is good, then it's a good thing. If evidence is provided that my path is wrong, I'll take that. But I struggle with this hypersimplification of our society into the progressives and the conservatives. On every issue, people have different views. You know, political strategists, they struggle with this all the time. How do you get people to listen to you on enough issues so that you get enough people to vote your party into power? I think we need to look at things more from the point of view of how do you say stuff? How do you communicate your ideas in a way that you're not crushing other people, right? Because if that public space is inherently toxic to a community, that community won't get hurt because they won't speak. And it's important that ideas be platformed, always platformed. It's just that ideas that have as a basis the othering of a community or something like this are problematic. They have to be framed in a way that stand on their own, rather than leveraging bankrupt ideas or bankrupt evidence that has been disproven. In my work, I deal constantly with disproven data that is regurgitated over and over again. I think this is the challenge that I see.
Thanks for your question. I'm not sure that I heard agreement. If we were to engage in Ms. Ogé's case, we'd probably be opposed to her, not because we like what happened to her, but because we think the provision of the Human Rights Code is actually, we've argued this before, many times we've lost, are hopelessly vague. They're very, very vague. We disagreed with the Supreme Court's decision in Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission and Watcott because we think that the publication provisions of the Human Rights Code, which are so loose they can cover all kinds of different things, although the Supreme Court has tried to narrow what they mean, what the words mean, we think that they're vague. That doesn't mean we like what has happened to Morgane, and it doesn't mean that we wouldn't stand next to her in denouncing it. But we are concerned about the use of the legal tool. So I actually disagree again with the premise. I don't think I heard agreement. And our organization considers itself cross-partisan. Our last board president to the current one was a card-carrying conservative. I don't know the political affiliation of the current one, but we have everyone from conservatives to Marxists on our board united around certain rights questions. So.
And also not hostile enough that prevented you from asking your question.
Well, it took a lot of guts to ask the question, and you can see that nobody actually answered why there is not somebody who is a non-progressive on the panel, and why that wouldn't have made for a better conversation. Anyway, I'll leave that with you and with the audience. That's really, the rest of it isn't profitable again because it is, I suspect it is a hostile group.
Thank you for your question. Kit.
Just a quick point. Is it possible and appropriate when people speak that they just say who they are? Is that okay?
So Kit is asking that when people ask a question, they introduce themselves.
If they want, I don't think people should be forced to.
Yeah. If they want to. If they choose to. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really appreciating the conversation in terms of state and legal recognition, but I was wondering if we could maybe reorient the conversation towards mutual recognition. And, I don't have a problem with this kind of demarcation of left and right. I think, it's somewhat real, somewhat fragmentary, but I think many of us here probably identify with the left. Don't think that's a huge problem. I'm interested in discussing how we could potentially achieve this mutual recognition that's necessary to provide a countervalence to, the authoritarianism that is necessarily looming, and how we can mutually recognize each other without falling into this propensity to liquidate all opposition, whether it's in discourse, whether it's virtual or non. I see a lot of tendencies in hostilities towards disagreements on the left, and not everything can be reduced to data or fact. There's a lot of affective problems happening here. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about some of the more micro and interpersonal issues we're dealing with.
Thank you.
Should we just go in order?
Anyone wants
Sure, whatever.
Well, thanks so much, Emily. That's a terrific question. I would say that I think sometimes the tendency within the left to shut down debate and discourse, which, again, to reiterate, I'm seeing more and more, and I think is a real problem. Again, just to reiterate that point, because I'm not sure it got taken up or understood. I think some of it comes from a sense of powerlessness, isolation, and a sense that it is necessary to control the discussion, to control communications. And I think that just to tag on to what Josh was saying about what can be done, I think that there needs to be perhaps some lessons learned from organizations, political parties, like the Black Panthers, which is something like, rather than looking at the state, because as you recognize, this is a settler state. It's an organization of colonial violence. So we have to look at it dialectically, that it is both the source of some remedies, but also the source of a lot of brutality as well, ongoing brutality. So self-organization, I think, is really important. And as we move forward, and as our state, my sense is it's going to become ever more authoritarian. We've already seen what's happening in the United States, and it's really disturbing with the child separations. Now with the reorganization, or with the shuffling of the Supreme Court and so on, this looks really, really dire. So I think self-organization is really important. We can learn from the Panthers' provision of school lunches to children in impoverished schools in Oakland, sickle cell anemia testing programs, self-defense, which was also in this province manifested by the East Indian Defense Organization against racism, against racist attacks. I think building communities up, I think, is a positive dimension of this discussion, and it has to be within the realm of civil society. We can't simply look to the state and its laws to protect us, because as we know, laws change. Even constitutions can change. More difficult, of course, but constitutions can change. And if we're caught unawares by these changes, then we're not in a good place. So I think there are other such examples. Slut walks, take back the night. There are a number of examples, and of course, indigenous resistance has to be front and center as a model for self-organization and the integrity of communities and their ability to resist. These kinds of things really have to factor into this. It's not about simply looking to legal forms of remedy. And also, of course, again, as I said, transforming the social field in which hatred and racism and prejudice emerges in the first place. That has to be dealt with.
So I'm in the trenches, right? So I fight for rights. That said, I agree that litigation is the last resort, and it's the most expensive and the least satisfying. Even though it's really satisfying to win something or change the law, changing the law was really satisfying. But without changing the hearts and the minds, you've won nothing, right? All you've created is resistance. The first step that we always applied in my crew tends to be actually to access conservative spaces that might be amenable to our message. And this is where our strongest allies come from. In the trans rights law work in BC, the way we managed to get the law changed here was we reached out to evangelical churches in the Fraser Valley. And I spent an entire summer going from church to church to church to talk to the leaders and to try to convince them to take a slightly different approach on the pulpit. And those people, that work really paid off. There's no doubt that hearts and minds are won through education and advocacy and through personal relationships. Bridge building is much more powerful than coercion. But that said, inevitably at the end, you get to your goal, you have your goal, and then you have to deal with the miscreants, right? The people who just refuse. They will not be changed. They will not do what you hope they would do. You can educate the next generation. That can be done in the schools and so forth. And, you know, everybody's on side except that very small group. And that group, unfortunately, is often intransigent and highly polarized by social media, which is a terrible disruptor in society. It does a lot of good, I know, but it also does a great deal of damage to social discourse. And yeah, it's used as a weapon by most people who really have a stake in Twitter, and this is really sad that this is what the tool is for.
I don't want to take up much time, but for us, we've been watching with concern. We're not on campus. I'm not there to see what's happening, but we do hear reports of all the deplatformings that are happening, of the attempts to just stop people from talking at all or from being heard. And I can understand the impulse that drives those feelings, but it concerns me because I feel like I get better in the arguments that I make by hearing, by testing them against those who I disagree with. And it strikes me that to some extent, and I don't think this is universal, but certainly in these high-profile instances, you see somewhat of a trend, and I'm not in a position to document it, towards shifting away from the ability to have those kinds of interactions, while recognizing that, again, with the social media and the changes, like it used to be that you would have debates on campus and that's what it would be. Now there's all this other accoutrement around it that creates a much more menacing atmosphere for folks. It changes the experience. So I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but it is something that I'm concerned about. I'd also want to say that I don't think territorial recognitions should be considered as part of a progressive agenda. I think it's just a fact, it's a legal fact, that these are unceded territories. It was the Harper government who apologized, for example, for residential schools. It's something that should be cross-partisan.
Yeah, just pointing out, we have time for a few other questions, whoever is interested. Just I wanted to point out that with your question, I was thinking what I often hear in the consulting room coming from people who are in, let's say, grassroots activism, that sometimes the anti-oppressive becomes oppressive, that there's no space for discussion about difference, and that's something so important to foster as let's not make this anti-oppressive place an oppressive one. So, yes, please.
Well, I was sued for $5.6 million by Kinder Morgan, so I'm not going to throw away the state. I think we've argued for anti-SLAPP legislation for quite a while, and I'm not going to abandon that fight. And I'm hoping that we'll get good legislation in the fall. I think it's really important. As you said, what's happened with SLAPP suits is that we have more people that are afraid to speak out because they're going to get sued. They're going to lose their property. They're going to lose everything they have, and they're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars fighting huge corporations in the courts. So We use the state. We have to use the state, and it's naive, I think, to deny that or to abandon that. We struggle to get our candidates
Nobody's
elected.
saying that, though. Okay. Nobody's saying that.
Okay. We're struggling to get our candidates elected so that we can get power in the state. But the other thing is, I think, that we have to recognize is that, and as I think some people have said, that we are moving towards fascism. It's a very scary situation worldwide. And I think what we have to recognize with fascism, it's not simply a matter of debate, it's a matter of economic crisis. We have a working class that's torn to pieces, lost unions, lost representation, and they're being organized. The left is not organizing, just as in Nazi Germany. The left is divided, terribly divided, on all kinds of grounds. And so we are losing the battle. I work with the Canadian Anti-Racism Education and Research Society. So a lot of our work is with hate groups, and a lot of our work is with members of hate groups, and we try to work to get them out of those groups. And it's a very tough job, because the ideology has to be understood and not just simply dismissed, as somebody I think was saying. But the issue here is the crisis, the economic crisis. It's not simply a matter of debate here. It's a matter of changing the institutions. And it's going to involve mobilization. We brought 4,000 people to City Hall in August. But that's just a small number. We have to bring many more people out, many more people who are proud and courageous and who will fight.
Thanks.
If I could just respond to that, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, and this is what I'm saying. We've actually got to diagnose the disease, which has to do with socioeconomic crisis, and the way that, not just the crisis, but the way in which that crisis becomes framed politically. So the source of the crisis are the migrants. The source of the crisis is the other. The source of the crisis has nothing to do with the structure of corporate power. So these are the kinds of things that we're more and more inhibited from talking about, because we're still so stuck in identity questions. Not to say they're not important, but there has to be a view, not just to the questions of recognition, as was recently put in a political philosophical debate, but questions of redistribution and questions of fundamental socioeconomic power, which I think is what you're getting at, Alan. But no one's saying we abandon the state. Nobody's saying that. We have to look at it as both a kind of mechanism, institutional structure of civilization and of barbarism at the same time. I think this is really, really key. I think if I could just sort of sum up the argument that I was trying to make is that the left has to be careful for what it asks for, because some of the things that it asks for, as Josh was suggesting, can turn against it quite quickly. And it was Dworkin McKinnon, I believe, who had some input into the anti-obscenity laws that were ultimately deployed against Little Sisters. And what did the customs officers really target? A book by a bisexual trans man, Patrick Khalifa, right? If I'm not mistaken. You see this over and over again: speech codes, restrictions on what can be said when and how are often deployed against often their very advocates. And the Palestinian case is exactly to the point. If you talk about addressing the question of redistribution, the one person who's forwarding this discussion in the most robust way is Jeremy Corbyn. But Corbyn is being attacked from both within the Labour Party and, of course, from without it, especially within the Tory Party, for his anti-Semitism, because he's critiquing Zionism. They're conflating Zionism and so anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. This has got to be nipped in the bud, but we can't do that because we ourselves are so geared to creating protections for groups, which then tends to get overextended, overinflated in ways that becomes problematic politically. So I think this is really, for me, the key issue. So
just a question there. I don't have anything.
Yeah. Is that okay? I guess I'm not on the right, but my question could be construed that way. Was the left wrong when they said money is not speech, with reference to the Citizens United case? And I guess I'm taking this opportunity to talk about it because of Justice Kennedy's stepping down from SCOTUS today. My second thought there simply is that the identity in this case matters the most, and I wonder if the schema through which we've been discussing this tonight, harm versus offense, doesn't really match the actual identity of a corporate body's right to free speech. And yeah, I mean, we need to get our heads around that probably if we're going to make progress.
We haven't really talked about like speech restrictions in the context of elections, other than briefly touching on the Facebook collusion, no collusion. There's totally no collusion. So I think that's an issue that one could have a whole panel on just that. I'm not sure that I know what you meant when you said, was the left wrong when they said money isn't speech? Because I thought lots of folks on the left have complained about the inequality of economic resources at election time, and had argued that it was, and therefore more money meant more speech, and that wasn't fair. So I think that those questions around electoral participation and election advertising, all that kind of stuff in the context of Facebook, and I think really needs a sharp look that responds to the new reality. And I don't know what the answer ought to be, but
I guess my question really has to do with that old chestnut about the rights of a minority within a democracy, as a minority, not individuals within a protected class, but as a corporate body themselves. Is there a further claim? In this case, Citizens United won the day as a corporate entity.
Right.
That could,
like corporate persons having rights under the law. So, I mean, there's a whole huge question around that. In Canada, they do. It's why, although we regulate tobacco ads, those ads do violate were found to violate the freedom of expression rights of those companies, but then it was found that was justified under the circumstances. By the way, it's the same way that a group like the BCCLA is able to go in and argue in court on a whole bunch of things. So I'm not sure it lends itself to an easy answer. I think there are good things you could think of and harms that you could think of. So I won't endeavor to try and conclude on it, but there you go.
Thank you. We are going to wrap up here. I really appreciate your presence here. I want to thank each of one of you for your thoughts, for your participation, for inspiring us. And if there's any other questions, there are going to be a few minutes here. Thank you very much.